Great. Well, thanks for joining us today for our discussion of reapportionment and redistricting. This is kind of just the beginning of this series for us, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. But we'll do some work today to talk about the reapportionment process, how that's going, and then also a bit of an introduction into redistricting. But there is still a lot to cover there. So thanks for hopping on today. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, and I will try and keep an eye on them as we're going, but also feel free to unmute yourself if I'm missing something or you have a question or comment you want to add. Awesome. So we'll go through really quickly who we are. Like I said, a history of reapportionment, talk a little bit about the 2021 reapportionment, and then do like I said, just an introduction into redistricting a little bit and talking some about gerrymandering as well. So we are part of the Fair Election Center. It's a national nonpartisan voting rights advocacy organization. And within that, myself and Rahila, who's on with us today, work with Campus Vote Project, which I think most of you would probably hear from your work with CVP today, so are familiar with us and our work with campuses to try and reduce barriers to student voting. Reapportionment and redistricting actually starts back last year with the census. It might be hard to remember now that time is flying by here, but we're almost halfway through 2021 at this point. But in all of the craziness that was last year, we also had a census year. So that meant, we basically, the census tries to count every person in the country at the time that the census occurs. And then that data is very important because that's what we use to do both reapportionment and redistricting. And it only happens once every 10 years. So pretty big deal to try and count everyone in a country, and something that we only do every 10 years. So a long time before we're gonna have another shot at doing this. So a little unfortunate, one, that it both happened during the pandemic, which made it much more difficult. But also under an administration that did not do a good job preparing for or executing the first census that was also largely online. That has led to some delays in the data being available this year, which we will dig into a little bit later in the presentation as well. But did want to just take a quick note, obviously what we'll be talking about today is kind of how that census data relates to voting rights. But did also want to note there's so many other important reasons for folks to participate in the census. This is just a table that got put together a couple of years back, looking at just some of the fiscal dollars that just the federal government disperses utilizing census data to determine which states and localities get funding for different federal programs. And it's just hundreds of billions of dollars every fiscal year that the federal government is using census data to distribute money out to the states for. So really big deal for voting rights, but also pretty big deal in a lot of other places. So much appreciation to anyone who worked with folks in their community, filled out the census themselves, or were part of even doing group housing reporting for their institution. It was really important work. So thanks to everyone who helped participate in that. So the difference between kind of reapportionment and redistricting is that reapportionment is kind of the process for reassigning seats within a legislative body, whereas redistricting is the actual kind of redrawing of district boundaries. So that's like the map making process. So we're going to talk about reapportionment today in regards to the U.S. House of Representatives. You can see this is actually the prior 2020, prior to the 2020 census. This was the distribution of seats kind of across the states. So very large states like California, Texas, Florida, having numerous representatives, and some of our small states over here to the right-hand side, only having 1 or 2 representatives in the House. And the process of reapportionment is redistributing kind of that limited number of House seats across the states. And then the follow-up to that is then redistricting, where the boundary lines are actually redrawn to balance population within those districts. So, always love source material around here at a voting rights organization. So reapportionment is actually, the redistricting process is in the Constitution. This is where we get the fact that they'll do an enumeration, that it'll happen every 10 years. And an interesting tidbit here, when they first did the original, in the constitutional language, says that the number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative. So pretty interesting that when they first set it out, they didn't have districts that would be more than 30,000 people in a congressional district. We've gotten pretty far from that, as you'll see here in a couple of slides. Just another kind of interesting tidbit. So this is not really in effect anymore, but part of the 14th Amendment, in section 2 of it, part of the way that they thought that they would actually enforce kind of some of the rules in the 14th Amendment is that they would dock states' population in the reapportionment process if they disenfranchised. And you can see here, this is prior to several other amendments, like the 19th Amendment or the 26th Amendment. So in the language of the 14th, it still refers to if you denied or abridged male inhabitants who were 21 years of age or older, before we change those things with some following constitutional amendments. So this actually isn't really in a force anymore, but just wanted to highlight that kind of this is also part of kind of that historical trajectory, of where we've gotten to now and how we actually do the process, based on how it started out back when the country was younger and much smaller and had a lot fewer states. Another interesting kind of tidbit buried in here, this other kind of orange highlighting, except for participation in rebellion or other crimes. This one snippet is kind of the justification that the Supreme Court has used to uphold felon disenfranchisement by states throughout the history of the country. So kind of sucks that this language is in here. We don't actually dock any of the states that are currently trying to suppress the votes of folks based on the legacy of the statute, yet that part of the Constitution is still being used to actually disenfranchise people from voting. So pretty crappy bit of history there, but thought folks might be interested. So reapportionment, Congress used to actually regularly pass both a census bill and a reapportionment bill, because as the country grew over time, they were adding these additional states and districts and seats. So the Congress would update both the reapportionment bill when it did the census bill, to say this is how many congressional seats there'll be, so that when the census comes back, we'll know how to split them up. And there was basically a constant increase in the size of the House as the country grew, until we got to the current 435 members. But that was back in 1910 for the 1911 kind of when the 1910 census data became available, and we did reapportionment and redistricting in 1911. So 110 years ago at this point, a very long time since the Congress has actually done a reapportionment bill in addition to a census bill. As such, the average size of a congressional district, and these numbers are still based on 2010 census data for the most part here, as we haven't actually done the redistricting process. So some of these things about district size aren't totally shuffled out yet. But just even up through the last census, the average congressional district has more than tripled in the last 100 years. So the last time there was a reapportionment bill, the average house size was around 200,000. And in 2010, the average house size was around 710,000. So pretty big increase there. This also meant because each state is guaranteed at least one House seat, and then within each state, sometimes you have slightly larger congressional districts as they split them up for states that were close to on the edge of either gaining or losing seats, sometimes then have average larger congressional seats within their state. So you actually have the largest congressional district, even after the 2010 census, had almost double the number of people of the smallest congressional district. So we remember back to looking at the Constitution, their limit said shall not exceed one for every 30,000. And now we're far and away from that. Hundreds of thousands of people were represented by every member of the House, given that the body hasn't expanded in over 100 years. So this last number here is newest. The smallest congressional district now will be in Wyoming, and it will only have 577,000 people in it. So that's the smallest congressional district. And even that is still a 60,000 increase from the 2010 number. So even in your smallest House district in a state that only gets one, still a very substantial increase again, this time after the last redistricting. Folks might have seen some of the census headlines that, this was the slowest rate of growth that the country has had in a very long time in the last census. But even that was still a rate of growth, even if it is slowing. And this map actually shows the redistribution of some seats that happened after the 2010 census. and you can see a bit of a continuing trajectory. This is the redistribution of House seats after the most recent 2020 census. So again, some kind of, Great Lakes region, Northeast states, losing population and losing districts out to some more southern and western states here. So Texas, the only state to actually gain more than one seat, they gained 2 seats. The rest of the green states, North Carolina, Florida, Montana, Oregon, and Colorado all gained 1. Everything in green did not have a change. And then all of the purple states lost a single seat. One of the interesting things is that part of the census process is how seriously each state takes it themselves. The federal government runs the census, but each state frequently does a lot of engagement on their own, public announcements, work to make sure that every person in their state is counted, because there is a direct financial cost to states by not having everyone who actually lives in their state counted. So interesting to see how the politics of that played out. In some states that did not put as much effort into this. There was a lot of speculation based on other survey data between now and the last census that Texas might have gained up to 3 seats. Florida was projected to gain 2. Folks thought that Arizona might gain a seat. And as you can see, Texas only got 2 and Florida only got 1. And several other states that potentially might have lost 2 seats, or some other states that might have lost 1 managed to hang on to those seats. It also seems like New York was on the bubble of potentially not losing any seats, and instead Minnesota might have lost a seat, and that came down to like a difference of less than 100 people that were counted in Minnesota that put them over the threshold to actually be the state that held on to that seat, and New York was the one that lost the seat. Any questions so far on any of the reapportionment stuff? Keep an eye on the chat. Yeah. 89 people, pretty wild. And part of that too is that Minnesota was the state, I think, that had the highest response rate out of any state in the country. They took a lot of pride in that. So one thing I did want to note is, this has all been kind of around the redistribution of House seats based on changing in populations, but just wanted to note, especially in the time we live in now, where we have a divided 50-50 United States Senate that only functionally gets anything done because the vice president breaks ties, but still does not get much done because of the 60 vote threshold for filibusters. The United States Senate is undemocratic. It was designed as a quote unquote compromise in the beginning of the country, when there were a lot fewer states and potentially not nearly as much population diversity across those different states, to try and appease different interests in bringing the country together. It is no longer viable to think that we live in a healthy democracy and have a body like the United States Senate or the Electoral College that it feeds up into. California's population in the 2020 census was 39,500,000, and California has 2 US senators that have 2 votes in the United States Senate. Wyoming's population was literally only 500,000, 39 million less people in Wyoming, and they still have 2 US senators. Yet they get the same vote in the United States Senate because they are a state, which is made up lines on a map. So 39 million people basically do not have equal representation to the state of Wyoming from California. This is how we can have things where the last presidential election, the winner of that race got 7 million more votes than the loser of that race, yet we think of it as being a very close race. 80,000 votes could have tipped the Electoral College the other way across 2 or 3 states. So this is part of what feeds into that. And I'll also just note the District of Columbia has a population of around 700,000 people. That is larger than 2 states, on par with the next 2 states after that, and has no federal representation. They have no US senators. They do not have a voting member in the US House. Even worse than that, the federal Congress retains control over some of the District of Columbia, so they can overturn their laws or prevent them from putting laws into place, which means folks literally as far away as Alaska get to vote for and elect people who are then able to exercise control over the District of Columbia. Yet the District of Columbia has actually no say not only in our federal body, but also really at the state level, since the officials that they can vote for mayor and for city council can have their decisions overturned by Congress, a body where they have no vote. So that's my tangent today on structural deficiencies in American democracy that need to be addressed. Back to reapportionment and redistricting, but I think hopefully a helpful and informative tangent. Because part of this too is that, part of reapportionment also feeds up into the electoral college. So the way the electoral college vote works is that each state's kind of congressional delegation determines the number of electors that state has in the electoral college. So all of those states that lost both a US House seat on that previous map will then also lose one elector in the electoral college that comes from that state. And all of the states that gained a US House seat will also gain an elector for the electoral college, which means those states also now have more weight in the electoral college in the determination of who actually becomes president as well, since we use the electoral college and the winner take all process of electoral votes from states mostly to determine who the president is. So that's 538 electors in the electoral college, which is where we get the 270 number to win. Folks who are astute will know that the District of Columbia is allotted 3 electoral college votes. That's how we get to the odd number of 435 House members, 100 senators, and then these 3 electoral college votes allotted to DC, despite their actual lack of federal representation within the congressional body. We'll also note that the US territories do not get any electoral representation. So that's American Samoa, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. They do not have congressional representation. They do not have reps or senators or electoral college votes at all. So kind of one last note sort of kind of on reapportionment here is that, I wanted to highlight, especially for folks in this space who do this type of work, is that because the census is designed to count people where they are at the time the census occurs, for students, that generally means they get counted in the spring at their campus address. This last time around with the pandemic, that upended things for a lot of folks. A lot of people were displaced, and it is one of the reasons that we'll talk about here with the census data delays. But generally speaking, what normally happens is that students are counted for the census at their campus address, and then those numbers are used to distribute political power. The numbers from the census are used to determine this reapportionment, and they will be determined for the population when folks are doing redistricting. So based on the students at your institution, or if you're a student joining us today, based on your person is earning electoral power for your campus area over time, once every 10 years. Yet I think, as many of us know, CVP has been involved in a number of times where local election officials, state election officials, and the laws that they pass do not view students as quote unquote like full-time residents, and they try and make it difficult for them to register and vote at their campus address. Yet those states and localities are getting political power based on those students' presence. So again, I think another thing that I wanted to highlight here that is a problem in our democracy that we should be working to address. And we'll note that there is a Supreme Court case on the 26th Amendment in the United States that basically affirms that right, that students may choose to register at their campus address, and they cannot be treated differently than any other member of the community when doing that, despite the fact that we know that that still happens in both informal and formal ways. So, 2020 was a crazy year. The pandemic upended a lot of things. And as we said, the previous administration also did a poor job preparing for and then executing the past census, especially given that there was a transition this time around, and that a majority of folks actually completed the census online this time, as opposed to through the mail. So part of what this means is that the Census Bureau actually just released some of that reapportionment data from the map that I showed you about kind of where total population by states is, so that they could do figures like how many congressional districts each state will have. Normally that data is available by December 31st. This is actually the first time the Bureau has missed that end of year deadline since that deadline was implemented in 1976. But what's really upending the cart here is that, those were just top line figures. there's more granular level data that's called like block level data that the census prepares and provides out to the states. And that is the data that they actually need to be able to do the redistricting process. So now that we move from reapportionment at the congressional level to redistricting, which happens up and down kind of the elected offices, they need this more granular level data. The census has said that that data may not be available until the end of September. They are saying that they'll potentially release like a legacy format that does not involve tables and is a bit harder for some states to use to do redistricting themselves in mid to late August. Normally this data is available to states in March, and they had originally said in several of the court cases around the ongoing census issues that they would have it by the end of July, and then this year had to update that again and actually just closed. They had reopened and were doing some additional counting in some undercounted areas even earlier this year to try and have enough data to be able to extrapolate out in those areas where they don't obviously have 100% response rates. So this can create some really big issues. Both New Jersey and Virginia have state elections in 2021. New Jersey actually had to adopt a constitutional amendment because their data is in their constitution that would allow them this time around to delay redistricting until 2023 and conduct their state elections under prior maps. Virginia also has elections this year and will be conducting them under the current districts. They have primaries coming up in June. And then elections in November. So it'd just be impossible for them to redistrict in a meaningful way and have those districts in place in time for this year's elections. Some other states that potentially will have some problems is, there are a number of states that have statutory deadlines, which will be a bit easier for them to change. So I actually just pulled out a couple of the states here that have constitutional deadlines for redistricting and have the earliest kind of deadlines for redistricting. So Maine has a June 11th deadline that is constitutional that they are not going to be able to meet, given that the data will not be available. California has an August 15th constitutional deadline for redistricting, and they've already preemptively gone to court to get an order to be able to delay that. They have a commission process, and they've already went and got permission to kind of adjust the commission's timeline based on the release of the census data. And then Ohio and Colorado both have September 1st deadlines, but the Colorado Constitution already has built in that the commission that does their redistricting is allowed to adjust its own deadlines based on things outside its control, like a pandemic and the delay in census data. But Ohio will also have to try and probably go to court and seek some type of judicial remedy to be able to not comply with their constitutional deadline for redistricting unless they're able to do it with August data, but that just seems entirely unlikely that they'll be able to complete redistricting in 2 weeks or less. So just wanted to flag that for some folks that probably start to see a lot more of that come up in the news over the summer and into the fall as this starts to happen. And a number of states have to start either get this kind of permission from court or pass legislative bills to address their legislative deadlines in a number of states around redistricting if they don't think they'll be able to meet them this year. So who does redistricting? The US Census Bureau, they basically do the figures for reapportionment, provide that to Congress, but it is actually at the state level that districts are redrawn. And the redistricting process, unlike reapportionment, happens up and down the ballot. So, reapportionment was really just for the US House, but redistricting will need to readjust the boundary lines to rebalance population kind of at the congressional level, at the state level, at the local level. So this map here on this page kind of shows who is in charge of congressional redistricting in each state. So as you can see, the vast swath of the country through these red ones, it's a bit different everywhere, but basically like these are places where the legislature has primary authority for redrawing congressional district maps. The orange states use commission processes for redrawing congressional districts, and the dark gray ones have a little bit of a hybrid process between the commission, like usually like a commission and the legislature. Like Virginia has a new process now where the commission produces maps and sends them to the legislature for an up or down vote, and then gets a second shot at it. And if the legislature turns them down a second time on that up or down vote, it actually goes to the Virginia Supreme Court and they draw the maps, and that's that. So an interesting process that they'll be trying for the first time this time around. largely for congressional districts, it is legislature driven. In some states, the governors don't even have the ability to veto these bills. It's just entirely left with the legislature. Sometimes it's like a regular bill that goes up to the governor and they can veto it. And then the commission processes have a whole range of things, largely around kind of like who's on the commission and how are their maps adopted, whether the commission can do it on its own or it goes back to the legislature or up to the governor. So this map is a bit prettier. It has a lot more colors on it. This is for state redistricting. It's kind of like who draws the state legislative districts. So a number of states have been more open to using commission type processes, especially for redrawing their state legislative districts. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the folks who you're basically, if you have a legislature that is predominantly responsible for drawing its own district lines and you have the most self-interested group of people being in charge of getting to draw districts, and obviously that has caused problems for a number of states and brings as it's not very democratic process to let the politicians who are going to be running in those districts determine how they're going to be drawn. So obviously still a large chunk of the country here, probably half of the states do still let the state legislature draw the legislative districts for themselves. But much more kind of experimentation, especially for this cycle and or the past redistricting cycle in 2010 and now this time in 2020. A number of states trying out different commission processes. That's becoming much more common. Did not used to be the case. So some independent commissions here, somewhere it's the state legislature is still responsible for it, but there's an advisory commission that produces maps and sends them to the legislature. Or commissions, but they're made up of political appointees in a number of states, a couple of different ways that folks are trying this out. So, and as I mentioned, like a number of these will be new or amended this time around. So Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, a number of the states kind of in this region, all experimenting with this for the first time. So, principles of redistricting, just to kind of take like a big picture look at this. Like I said, obviously all of the states kind of have their own processes for this, but some of the federal bounds for this is kind of the US Supreme Court and this thought of one person, one vote. So there's a string of kind of 60s era Supreme Court cases that sort of establish this principle. So even up to that point in time, despite the fact that we did things like reapportionment, just because we use that to distribute congressional districts across the states, prior to this time, we actually had vastly different population sizes kind of even within a state across their congressional districts until we kind of had these challenges kind of set up these principles. So Baker v. Carr basically held on like an equal protection theory under the 14th Amendment that is nearly as practical. One man's vote in a congressional district is to be worth as much as another's. And the Supreme Court has been like pretty exacting about this. They say like as equal as possible, very little room for deviation across congressional districts within a state. They must have kind of population balanced as much as possible. Reynolds v. Sims actually applied this same type of principle, but to state legislative districts. This one was totally crazy. They actually literally had a process where state Senate seats were distributed by county. So like every county in the state got a state Senate seat, regardless of its population. So you had a ton of rural counties that had very few people in them dominating the state legislature, and very large urban counties with big metropolitan cities also just having a single state representative. And that was struck down. And you can see the quote here from the court. Legislators represent people, not trees or acres. Legislators are elected by voters, not farms or cities or economic interest. But I will say the court has been a little bit looser kind of on when it comes to state legislative districts. This is not a hard and fast rule because the court never does things like that. But basically, the standard is, up to about a 10% deviation across districts has been tolerated kind of in past challenges. So that's like a rough rule of thumb that states use when redistricting sometimes at the state level, is to try and avoid getting to or above that 10% threshold. So again, on the federal level, we'll note, even this one person, one vote rule, much like I said about the state policy where they took it away and said you couldn't, you couldn't do your state Senate by county because it's in the Constitution. We do the US Senate by state, which means that these rules, even about balancing district populations, only applies to the US House Representative when you're doing redistricting, and only in a state that has multiple districts. Because if you only have one US representative in your state, you do not need to balance their district out, which is why we still kind of have some of those disparities that we talked about in the size of populations that are represented even across congressional districts, much less across the states for the US Senate. So these are kind of some other like general principles of redistricting that many of the states use themselves when doing this. The ones on the left are what sort of like the National Conference of State Legislatures has identified as like traditional redistricting criteria. They've been adopted by the vast majority of states and been used for quite some time. So these are things like compactness, contiguity, meaning that you can't have a district that is broken up into multiple pieces that aren't touching, the preservation of counties or other political subdivisions within the state, preservation of communities of interest, trying to preserve the core of prior districts is something that a lot of states have tried to put into place and utilize. So you don't see these like massive, just like start from scratch redrawings of maps generally in most states at this point going forward as they try and maintain kind of the core of previous districts so that you're only making adjustments around the edges to actually do rebalancing for population changes. And the last one is a number of states also have rules kind of avoiding the pairing of incumbents as a criteria, which can be helpful to try and prevent, political retribution. And then on the right, you have some emerging criteria. So these are newer things that have been, some of them were tried in the 2010 census, some of them are even newer since then. But it's actually kind of interesting. These are, I think, kind of responses to the fact that the Supreme Court has done nothing about partisan gerrymandering. So you've seen states kind of take two different approaches here to try and address that issue. One is like a prohibition saying you cannot favor or disfavor an incumbent candidate or party. So basically saying like you can't use that political data in your redistricting process because we know that folks then use that to try and favor one party or the other, as opposed to actually using these other principles around communities of interest and, preserving compact districts. So actually like that, or a prohibition on using the partisan data outright. So kind of these two approaches around just saying you can't use that data at all since we know people will abuse it. And then actually several states trying to actually implement like a competitiveness criteria to actually say we know that folks try and use political data for gerrymandering to try and either pick or choose their voters to make their districts favorable for themselves or disfavorable for their opponents. So instead, we're going to say you have to look at it and you have to try and make as many districts as competitive as possible so that you are balancing the kind of partisans within each district as much as possible as an explicit criteria. So be interesting to see how the states that are using these types of criteria is either prohibiting that type of behavior or that use of that data, or the ones that are explicitly saying you do have to look at it, but you have to look at it with the goal of attempting to make as many competitive districts as possible, how that plays out this time around. So we've done reapportionment, a very top level look at redistricting. We're going to talk a little bit about gerrymandering right now, but wanted to just pause quickly, see if folks have any questions or thoughts on things we've covered already. All right, great. Well, we'll keep going then. We'll talk kind of, cracking and packing is the colloquial term for the basics of kind of how gerrymandering occurs. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between racial and political gerrymandering, and then kind of wrap up with just a quick look at the For the People Act and what that might mean for congressional redistricting. But the term gerrymandering basically means it involves drawing district boundaries with the intent to favor one political party or constituency or even an individual. This is a political cartoon that ran back in 1812, kind of part of the lore of gerrymandering, where the term came from, up in Massachusetts. So thought that would be fun to include for folks today. But basically, kind of part of the way that gerrymandering works is drawing district lines with the express intent of basically trying to change the representation of who wins by kind of knowing the partisan makeup of those districts. And that's generally referred to, like I said, as cracking or packing. So by cracking, you're basically like diluting the voting power of the opposing party supporters by splitting them up across as many districts as possible. So that they can't reach a majority in any district. And then packing is kind of the converse of that, where you concentrate the opposing party's voting power in one district, but then that also means that you're then reducing their ability to elect their candidate of choice in other districts. So you can see kind of in the district example here, you have 50 precincts, 60% of them are blue, 40% are red. So ideally representation for that would look like you would have 3 blue districts and 2 red districts based on that 60-40 split. But one thing that you could do is you could have these, they call them compact but fair, but this is basically they've gone ahead and kind of cracked the red district vote across every one of these districts so that they never can reach a majority, so that you end up with 5 blue districts. In the reverse, you kind of see on the other end these neither compact nor fair districts. And basically what they've done here is they've deployed both packing and cracking, so that even though with a minority of the vote, they are able to win a majority of seats as red districts. By packing, they have some districts here that are almost entirely blue. They've packed that vote in there and then cracked up the remaining vote across 3 districts so that they can have a majority of political power with minority of votes. A thing to note too is that this cracking and packing really only works when you have basically a 2-party winner-take-all system, which is how the majority of our elections are run in this country. We have some places that are starting to use things like ranked choice voting or multi-member districts or a combination of both. But if you have 2 parties and it takes a majority to win, then you can effectively draw lines and use things like cracking and packing to kind of move away from what ideal representation would look like based on the actual share of the vote that is won by a particular party. Any questions on that? Great. So like I said, there's 2 kind of key types of gerrymandering that we think about in this country that have been like litigated in the courts. One of those is racial gerrymandering, and then the other is partisan gerrymandering. Oh, Jacob, what's the first step to fixing the 2-party system? I think it's hard to say what the first step is. I think it really depends. I think things like ranked choice voting could help, but in any time that you basically have like winner take all type elections without something else, then there's not really room in the country for a third party. If you had like more at-large races with proportional representation given to parties that ran in there, just more like the UK model, then you might see a proliferation of other parties. But to be honest, in the United States history's past, you've seen more of sometimes a short-term fracture within one of the parties or across the parties that eventually just lead to realignment of ideologies, people, geography across the 2 major parties again. So without changing kind of the underlying systems we use and the motivations they provide, I don't think that the United States will get away from being primarily just a 2-party system. So racial gerrymandering, federal law is actually, I wrote here kind of that they conflict, but they haven't actually been in conflict, but they seem like conflict on paper. You basically have the Voting Rights Act, which mandates the use, kind of like we were talking about as for redistricting with partisan criteria. The Voting Rights Act says that you have to, in some cases, you need to look at race data to make sure that you are not diluting the votes of minority groups So you have to use it, whereas the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, even prior to the Voting Rights Act, establishing those prohibitions under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, we've kind of seen a prohibition on using race to discriminate against folks, having that be the primary rationale for a redistricting plan. So the Equal Protection Clause says you cannot use race as the primary rationale for redistricting. That's discriminatory. But under the Voting Rights Act, we've basically carved out a space where we said to respond to those needs, you actually can use race-based data to make sure that you are not diluting the votes of minority groups and that they're not being discriminated against. So in the development of that case law, basically has led to the creation of majority minority districts. And I just sort of pulled it out here. One of the key Supreme Court cases that really started that off around the Voting Rights Act and those prohibitions around vote dilution kind of sets out this like 3-part test for vote dilution that eventually leads to what you need to do to establish kind of a case that a redistricting process was unfair if it could have created more majority minority districts, which has happened in a number of cases. So to try and summarize this quickly without spending too much time on it for folks is that, basically racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional and can be successfully challenged in federal court in the United States. I say that because the difference here when we talk about partisan gerrymandering, which is using basically like Republican Democrat data to then draw districts that are more favorable to one party or the other, you cannot successfully be challenged in federal court currently. So what this means, though, is the U.S. Supreme Court has never held a partisan gerrymander to be unconstitutional, but this is not because they've found the practice to actually be constitutional in of itself, but the court has never been able to establish a majority vote for a standard to evaluate basically like when partisan gerrymandering becomes unconstitutional. So a number of different theories in a number of cases over the last several decades have been brought trying to put forth different standards that the court could adopt and use to say when basically when the advantage that one party gets from the drawing of the district lines becomes so untenable that it is unconstitutional. Unfortunately, this just happened very recently as well. Folks thought, based on some of the statistical models that have been put forward now that the court might be more amenable to a last time around. And unfortunately, it failed again. But I will note that also just in the last couple of years, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had a case where they found an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander, and they did that based on state law under the state constitution. So the way things kind of currently stand in the US is that, for federal courts, they can adjudicate cases that are alleging racial gerrymanders, or violations of that one person, one vote theory that we talked about before around having unbalanced populations within districts or using kind of racial data to disadvantage or dilute the votes of minority groups and prevent them from electing their candidates of choice. But currently, if a state wants to use partisan data as their primary factor in its redistricting process, there is not Supreme Court precedent that says that is unconstitutional and that can be overturned by federal courts. So I do see here, yeah, so this is where it does get tricky, is it because due to kind of racial and polarized voting within the country, especially geographically, one of the things we've seen in more recent years as the court has continued to refuse to set out a standard on partisan gerrymandering is that states will say that they have used partisan data in the drawing of district lines, but then they still end up having the effect of diluting the votes of minority groups or packing them into individual districts and thereby diluting their votes in neighboring districts. So it is a bit tricky. It makes it a bit harder for those cases to be successful, but we have seen a number of cases where states have basically, in one of the last North Carolina gerrymandering federal lawsuits, they admitted in court, the legislators did, that they used partisan data to attempt to get as many congressional districts for Republicans as possible. Normally, you would think that that would be the smoking gun for this to be unconstitutional, but because there's not a standard, it really came down to actually presenting expert witness and digging into the testimony and the maps to show the impact that it had, and that it was a racial gerrymander. But that can be a lot more difficult because, you know, this is getting a bit in the weeds, but, you know, some of this is around both you have to look at both the intent as well as the impact when looking at these cases. You can do it without intent, but it gets harder to prove. If you can show the intent was to do a racial gerrymandering, it's open and shut. But if you're just trying to do it based on data and the impact, that gets very hard. But so, like I said, wanted to try and keep this short for folks today, just cover, you know, reapportionment since that's already happening, and do a bit of an introduction here to what redistricting might look like across the country and some of these key kind of principles that states will be thinking about and some of the legal framework around it. But as we mentioned and saw on a number of the maps earlier, this is a very state and local based issue. So, you know, we'll be working on and trying to work with some coalitions of groups in the nonpartisan space to do some trainings and provide some materials, especially around community map making come the fall, so that, you know, campuses or other communities of interest can make their own maps based on kind of the tools and software that's available these days. It's become a lot easier to do that. So we'll try and help folks navigate that in case they want to do that themselves. And that way, depending on whether it's a legislature or a commission in your area, you can at least do your own community map making and help build up that record that gets submitted to them for their consideration, depending on who the decision makers are in your state. And Campus Vote Project will be doing some state level redistricting program in all the states where we have staff and fellows. So that's Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Texas come the fall. The last thing I'll just share today too is that, you know, the For the People Act has passed the House. It is in the Senate right now. It is very unclear what's going to happen next. Leader Schumer has said that failure is not an option, and that, you know, the For the People Act has been labeled S1 in the Senate to show the priority that they've placed on it. But there are 49 senators who have endorsed it. Senator Joe Manchin has not, and has very recently expressed additional concerns around it. So without 50 votes, it definitely cannot pass. And without a change to filibuster rules, even at 50 votes, it will not pass. So very uncertain, but did want to highlight that the For the People Act, at least for congressional district redistricting, since it's federal legislation and can only impact federal elections, it would basically overhaul this process across the states. It would require all of them to use independent commissions. It would explicitly ban partisan gerrymandering, which then would create a statutory right to challenge it, the same way that the Voting Rights Act has for racial gerrymandering, as we discussed. It would expedite kind of the judicial process for challenging redistricting maps, and then would require public posting of maps and the data used for them for a minimum of 30 days in every state. And would just generally bring kind of the same as the For the People does for registration and voting, some level of uniformity across the country for folks to feel like they understand what the process is and how they can get involved in it, and that it's not being manipulated for partisan gains in particular states. So I think that's all we've got for today. So really appreciate everybody taking the time. I know it's kind of the end of the semester here, looking into the summer. But really wanted to take the time to at least talk about reapportionment and start getting folks thinking about redistricting now, as a number of states will start to make plans for this over the summer, so that when the data is available from the Census Bureau in the fall, they can, you know, the process will move very quickly in a number of states that are trying to meet their deadlines, given how late they're going to be getting the data this year. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate it, and I'll stick around for a little bit in case anybody's got questions on this or just wants to chat or say hi, but I'm gonna stop